So if Christ intended to return in 1863, then all that is written in Daniel, all that is written in Revelation, the prophecies of the end of the world needed to be fulfilled by 1863, including Revelation 18, when it talks about the woman riding the beast, her cup being filled. All of that needed to be fulfilled by 1863, over 150 years ago. So in understanding this history, God prepared them, showed what it should have looked like through his prophet Ellen White, and what she documented in the predecessor, the book that came before the Great Controversy. And this is Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1. First Spiritual Gifts. And in First Spiritual Gifts, it's like a predecessor to the Great Controversy, but without the Sunday law as she explains it in 1888. It's what prophecy, the fulfillment of prophecy, could have looked like if Daniel and Revelation, the Great Controversy, was wrapped up by 1863. It's very important for Adventism to understand, but they don't understand this. When she talks about the Sunday law as it should have been for them here, and we mark that as 1850, it's the chapter in First Spiritual Gifts called The Sins of Babylon. And it's here that she's going to say the United States has fulfilled Revelation 18. The cup of sin of the United States is full. God can now judge them. I just want to read a little bit of this. She says that she sees, God has shown her the state of the Protestant churches since the second angel proclaimed their fall. So since the history of 1840 to 1844, the Protestant churches have been growing more and more corrupt. It is impossible to distinguish the Protestant churches from the world. Their ministers take their texts from the Bible but preach smooth things. We could say that about Adventism today. The natural heart feels no objection to this. Adventism does not feel any objection to what their smooth ministers are preaching to them. She goes on and on talking about Protestantism, the churches, Protestantism. The churches have been filling up with every unclean and hateful bird. She's bringing in the language of the fulfillment of Daniel and Revelation. I saw great iniquity and vileness in the churches. Over their evil traits, they throw the cloak of religion. I was shown the pride of the nominal churches. So she goes on and on and on about Protestantism. The fearful threatenings of the third angel are to be realized in her lifetime in that history. They will drink of the wrath of God. She goes on in the following chapters to explain what the wrath of God was, and it was the Civil War. Again, 1861 to 63, their cup has been filled, and they're going to feel the wrath of God. What we would also describe, and she calls the time of trouble. So what is their cup full of? We know all heaven beholds with indignation human beings, the workmanship of God, reduced to the lowest depths of degradation, slavery. So the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation were to be fulfilled. One of the reasons that the language in Daniel and Revelation is not more explicit is because God wants them to be able to see it as applicable to them, not us in 2022, but to them in Millerite history. Revelation has to be read so that that cup, they could understand, oh, this is slavery. This is how God views slavery. We're going to experience the wrath of God and then see what that wrath looks like. Then they need in 1888 to look at that cup and say, oh, this is what God hates. Now today in 2022, we need to be able to read those exact same verses and look at the cup, see it full of misogyny and sexism and traditional family values and cultural norms, gender norms. Look at that cup and see, oh, that is what God hates, and hate it the way He hates it. They were to hate slavery the way God hated slavery. We have to hate sexism the way God hates sexism. So the language is written in such a parable way so that each generation can look at it and learn what they need to learn for their own generation. She says, God's anger will not cease until He has caused the land of light, the United States, to drink the dregs of the cup of His fury, and until He has rewarded unto Babylon double. Who is she calling Babylon? The United States, holding the cup filled with slavery. It could be fulfilled in their own time. But I want to step outside of that picture. That's what Ellen White gives us. She shows us this story of Protestantism. And if we go back as we have, we can see that Protestants, the churches in the South, defended slavery by using the Bible. Passages such as Abraham kept slaves, where God instructs them on how to keep slaves and who they are to enslave. Passages where it talks about Solomon keeping slaves as God had ordered. When it talks about Paul telling slaves to go back to their masters and submit. In the same chapters where he's telling women to submit to their husbands, he's telling slaves to submit to their masters. So Protestantism, the churches, and the vast majority of the United States, it's rooted on this Protestant foundation. They're going to defend slavery through their Protestantism. So if we could talk about the USA, and I'm going to divide it up, we're going to talk about the white colonists hold slaves, and they're going to defend that through the Bible. Through how they read. It's repeating today. The United States is taking away women's fundamental human rights, and they're defending that through the Bible. And Adventism is saying, amen. We're with Protestantism, because Adventism is reading the Bible the same way Protestantism is reading the Bible. So I want to step away from that for a moment and talk about the Native American tribes. And I'm going to list that there were 5 tribes who were known as they were the dominant tribes. The 5 dominant tribes were the Cherokee Indians, the Chickasaw tribe, the Choctaw tribe, the Creek tribe, and the Seminole tribe. And I haven't gone through all of them, and I won't go through all of them, but I want to discuss some of these tribes' practices. Some of the Native American response to slaveholding, and you don't hear this discussed normally. I have never heard in my life a discussion on how Native Americans thought about slavery and slaveholding. The Cherokee tribe. The proportion of Cherokee families who held slaves was comparable to the white families of the South. So the percentage of white families in the South that held slaves was about equal to the percentage of Cherokee families that held slaves. They held slaves in equal proportions. Recently, there was come to light a fight that is taking place between the current Cherokee tribes in the United States, as they are in, this was particularly coming to light in 2021, and descendants of the slaves that the Cherokee Indians held. And the fight was that the descendants of the slaves wanted admittance into the current Cherokee tribe, because along the lines there had been some mixing, some children had to African American slaves held by the Cherokee tribe, and the descendants of those children wanted admittance into the tribe because they were descended also from the Cherokee tribe. And the tribes aren't acknowledging them or letting them in, and it's coming down to some legal battles. But just a couple of quotes just to prove my point. In 1827, the Cherokee developed a constitution. It prohibited those in slavery and their descendants, including mixed race, from owning property, selling goods or produce to earn money, and marrying Cherokee or European Americans. It just reflected all of the slavery laws held in the southeastern United States. They had the exact same types of laws regarding slaveholding and how to own and treat slaves. In 1809, the Cherokees held about 600 enslaved Africans. By 1835, that was 1,600 to about 4,000 slaves by 1860, even after they were removed to Indian Territory. So it's causing a fight between the Cherokee today and the descendants of the slaves that they held. And the practices and the treatments was comparable to the Southeast. The Chickasaw tribe, again, similar laws mimicking the culture of the American South. The Choctaw tribe, also held in their constitution, mirrored the Deep South. In response to pro-slavery ideology in the Native American nations, creating a climate of animosity towards free African Americans. So the Native American nations, the pro-slavery ideology was creating more and more animosity against freed African slaves. The Choctaw General Council enacted legislation in October of 1840 that mandated the expulsion of all free black people unconnected with the Choctaw and Chickasaw blood by March of 1841. Those who remained were at risk of being sold at an auction and enslaved for life. The Creek tribe. In Creek society, they held slaves before the arrival of Europeans and Africans in Creek country, but those held in slavery were simply captives of war. Non-combatant women and young children were enslaved. So It was mostly women and young children who were taken in, enslaved, and forced into various roles. But what I find particularly interesting is one of the reasons that the Creek tribe saw African slaves as being inferior, as they're inferior, is for the Creek, working, labouring out in the fields was women's work. So when they saw the plantations of the white people and they saw African men working under the sun, growing cotton or whatever the produce was, it reinforced the idea that these African men were inferior because they were like women. So it also brings in the sexism that contributed to why they viewed these slaves as inferior. It was because, particularly for the Creek, it was because African men were doing women's work. And everyone knows, before colonialism arrived on the shores of the United States, they knew before then that whatever was female was inferior. And when they see African men doing women's work, they believed African men to be inferior. And then they also bought and participated in the slave trade and held slaves. So here, if I just put the Creek tribe here, they held slaves, as did the other main 5 tribes. Why? Why did they? It wasn't because they were converting to Protestantism. It wasn't because they were becoming Christian. It wasn't because they were using the Bible. They were mostly through this time period still holding to their traditional spiritual beliefs. So why? Ellen White is very targeted in what she's discussing. She needed to be. She knew who the enemy was, the enemy of God, who controlled the government in Washington. It wasn't the Creek who held Washington, who held Congress, who held the executive branch, who held the Senate. That wasn't the Creek. It wasn't the Creek who God was referring to in Revelation 18. It wasn't the Creek who held any type of profession. It was quite limited in their history. But we know it doesn't stay limited because it didn't stay here. Because this failed and history kept going. And now we have the first time Christ should have come back in 1863. Second time, 1888 history, not in 1888, but in that history. And then in sometime in our own lifetime, in our own history, in the imminent future. Back here, it was all targeted. It was all central on the United States, what was coming out of Congress, and what Protestantism was defending: slavery, the sin. In 1888, it spreads to Christendom. 2022, the history of the 144,000. This is worldwide. And when I say worldwide, that has implications for me, because Australia isn't included back here. Australia isn't included back here. Australia, now it hits Australia as much as it hits Fiji, as much as it hits Tahiti, and it hits Ghana, and it hits Romania and Russia and the UK. It's not limited to Christendom. It's still Christendom, but now it is worldwide. It is India. It is Brazil. It is Colombia. It is worldwide. And this movement represents that. Back here, God's people, those who truly understood what was happening, was mostly centered in the United States. And they didn't have the technology to be able to broadcast that. 1888, God has the communication, the travel has advanced and it's spread through parts of Europe, but it still hasn't spread worldwide. Now with technology, what God wants to teach people can go worldwide, and that is exciting, but it has implications to how we need to view the Sunday law. It's not enough to go back and say it was church and state in 1863, it was church and state in 1888, because even back here, it was church and state in 1850 when the cup of the United States filled when they enacted that 1850 compromise based on slavery. But even here, the root of racism is not Christianity, is not religion. The Creek were not holding slaves because they were believed in the Bible. They were holding slaves because that is just how humanity works. Because oppression is satanic. And as Elder Terry has been teaching us, it showed itself at the Tower of Babel, it spread out from the Tower of Babel, and it impacted everyone. Part of what left from the Tower of Babel made its way to the shores of America before it was called America, and was continued by the Creek. Their beliefs of gender was continued by the Creek. It didn't come over on a boat. It did come over on a boat for the people on the boat because they were as sexist and racist as everyone else. But you can't just pin it on religion. And when the Sunday law events all take place in the United States, and we're already in the thick of it, it's going to look, in some aspects, Christian. It's going to look Protestant, because to get elected in the United States, you want as many votes as you can get. So if you are like Donald Trump, you want to stand in front of a church and hold a Bible upside down because you have only looked at a few in your life for a photo opportunity, because that will get you more votes. It doesn't mean that they're really Christian or they really believe it. But if you can talk about God, you'll get more votes. So the people that get in, the people that get nominated for the Supreme Court, that satisfy enough of the Republican branch, they're going to tend to talk religion. But why we have started to say it's not church and state is because we want to make a couple of points. We want to say first, this issue is global. It's completely global. And when we say it's church and state, and we mean Protestantism, Christianity and state, what then happens if someone is a member of the movement and they are in India and there's a Hindu background? How does that impact the way women are viewed and treated, how they respond to the final warning? How does it affect their response? They need to see that it's come through Hinduism. But deeper than that, it's come through culture, because culture is who we fundamentally are. It's what has created us. It's what we're molded in from the time that we're born, from the time that we're babies. That is how deep sexism runs. And we can see that when we look back even on their history, even though this was church and state defending slavery, this was Protestant ministers defending slavery in the United States, we can look across here and look at the Creek and say they were just as bad. They were oppressed, they were victims of the colonists, but they They were just as racist. Why? Because their descendants came from the Tower of Babel, the same way their descendants came from the Tower of Babel, and they all took it with them. And to try and make that point, we've started using culture instead of church. Church is too shallow a reasoning. It's still true. It's still true to look at the United States and see Protestantism, church and state. Everything we've taught in the past about the Seven Mountains theology and the way that this old and incorrect reading of the Bible is being forced on people through the right-wing politicians and the right-wing Supreme Court. All of that is still true. If people teach today the United States is turning into a type of church and state relationship, it's true, but it's shallow. And when we just see it as shallow, we miss the deeper issue. It comes as a surprise to us when we see, oh, today, this is what Elder Terry was teaching this morning. An atheist enslaves women, is sexist. Why? They don't believe in God. What makes an atheist sexist is the same thing that made a Creek hold slaves. It's because it's come through their culture. So when we say church and state, it's still true, but it's shallow and it doesn't apply so easily everywhere. When we say culture and state, it gets to the fundamental root of the problem, and it's applicable through absolutely everywhere that this movement touches or wants to touch. We could go anywhere as a movement and make the same point that there is a cultural sexism, because there is no country on earth, no area, no group of people that doesn't have a problem with gender. And when we say culture and state, it shows that fundamental root, and it also shows us the solution to the problem. It isn't through shedding religion. Many people in the movement have thought that if they just became less Christian, if they just became more worldly, they would be better people and they would be less sexist. Some people have left the movement and become atheist because they thought that was the solution to sexism. Poor deluded people. They didn't realize that it wasn't Christianity that was the problem, it was culture. And God is trying to give us a solution to the problem. To do that, He has to target our culture. All of our cultures, everywhere that they exist. It manifests in different forms, but it's always there. It was there for the Creek when they saw an African man working in a field and thought, oh, he's working like a woman. They must be fit to be slaves. It's rooted deep. And this is what we're trying to get to at Vespers. If we can see the root of the problem, then we can really start to deal with it in a way that makes us fit to go to the world and give the world the warning that the world needs. If we aren't speaking to the world now, it's because we're not ready. And I would suggest we're not ready because we haven't understood this exact question correctly. We can't speak to the world because we haven't seen what sexism is rooted in and what the solution to it is. When we see it for what it is and we understand the solution as we need to, then in the Sunday law history, God will say, okay, now I have a people who are ready. Now there are 144,000 people ready to do a work, who can tell the world there's a solution to the mess you're in. It won't necessarily be the solution the world wants to hear because we don't have friends. We aren't there just to attack white people. We're not just there to attack Protestants. everyone ends up being challenged by the final warning. I'll hand back to Elder Terry. She might have thoughts or to add to that, or anything she wants to say, or people might have questions, but I'll hand back to Elder Terry.
Just further to that, Elder Tess.
Thank you, Elder
You
Tess.
mentioned India. Could you elaborate on that for us?
I use India and China as examples because India is especially now built on Hindu nationalism. So the United States is built on the don't kind of want to use inflammatory language, but the evil factions in the United States, the right wing, there's atheism in there, but it's built on a Protestant nationalism. But that Protestantism has become very much cultural. So if there is a school shooting, someone will send out thoughts and prayers. And they aren't necessarily praying, it's just that Protestantism has become kind of like their culture, it's their lingo, it's their language. But when you look at India, in a very strong fashion, they are built upon a Hindu nationalism. And this is what has been getting worse and causing so much persecution towards Muslims. So India, they believe that the real nationalists in India, they believe that Christians have their Jerusalem, their center of worship, that Muslims have Mecca and Medina, their sacred ground, and that Hindu people, their sacred ground needs to be India. So India needs to be for Hindu people only, and it needs to be preserved in India. That India itself is the sacred ground of the Hindu religion, in the same way that Jews and Christians look back to Jerusalem as a center, and the same way that Muslims look to Mecca and Medina. They want India strictly Hindu. And with that, they persecute people who are not Hindu, but especially Muslims, also some Christians. Then I like to speak about China, because China is built on atheism, their Communist Party. But if we go to all three, whether it's Protestant, which is heavily becoming just more and more atheistic, it makes no difference. It's sexist, it's sexist, it's sexist. And I bring these nations up just to reinforce that point, that it's cultural. Why are women viewed the way they are and treated the way they are so much in large areas of society within China? Why? It's not because they're Christian. It can be traced to their older spiritual beliefs. It slips my mind what religion they were. They held to. Sorry?
Confucius?
Confucianism. Confucianism was what was in China before the Communist Party brought in this atheism. And Confucianism is terribly misogynistic, terrible views of women and their role in the family and society. But they don't believe in Confucianism anymore, by and large. But Confucianism, it's just part of their current atheistic culture is not inseparable from previous Confucianism. The views of women didn't change when people became atheistic. Just the same way people become atheistic today, and they still view the world and women the same way as Protestantism. In some instances, worse with no hope or solution in mind. In many instances, worse. So I like bringing up India and China because it shows the root of the problem. It doesn't absolve Protestantism at all. Seeing the problem that the Creek had does not take away the sins that Ellen White places on white Southern slave owners. It doesn't absolve anyone of their sin. It just shows how broad and deep and horrible that sin is. It shows where the root of it has come from. And I think using India and China can help make that point. It's not Christianity, it is religion, but it's also not fundamentally religion, it's culture. And we've been teaching this, coming to this point for a long time in the movement. When we talked about homophobia last year, we showed how homophobia came down through gender roles, through Greece and Rome. But Greece and Rome, all descendants from the Tower of Babel, as are everywhere else. It was instilled in culture, the idea of those gender roles. And that is what God is trying to get to and to pull out. And that's why I think God's work is so hard. That's why it's taken him 6,000 years to try and address gender roles with humanity. It's very locked in. It's hard work, as I'm sure many are aware.
I think you've addressed that clearly, as it has to be something that involves gender equality.
The UN is really afraid right now of the xenophobia blooming in South Africa. It's turning into a situation that is really fearful. And we know South Africa has a history of apartheid. How they treated Black Africans was horrific. And still, the flow and effect of that treatment is very visible today. But now, how they're treating immigrants from other parts of Africa and how they're treating immigrants from Asian countries is creating a new brewing storm of racism within South Africa that is really terrifying. And it needs to be seen that this isn't a problem that's just that of the apartheid breakdown of color. This is a problem people need to address when a Black person in South Africa looks at an immigrant from Zimbabwe, how are they going to treat them? It's a deeper problem. And only getting to culture is going to properly address that, especially in the history of 2022. Racism is not our test today, but sexism is. And all of this is designed to show us where sexism has come from and what it takes to get rid of it. And it doesn't leave any culture untouched. That's the challenge of what is being faced. That's the challenge when someone let's say someone in Zimbabwe says, I want to pay a bride price and buy a wife. And someone in Canada says, I want my father to give me away as I walk down the aisle in a white dress. Everyone is being touched to see how these gender roles exhibit themselves. And what we're seeing is, as we approach the Sunday law, the situation for women worldwide is just getting worse and worse and worse. Because it's never been dealt with. It's never been taken down to the root of culture. It's never been seen as a serious issue as it is. It's never been taken to every single culture, and the world is failing. But someone did ask about what the Sunday law itself looks like, and we don't have long left, so I won't go deeply. Just to mention some things, I think stories we all already know really well. We know that the Sunday law event in the time of Christ was the stoning of Stephen. And I think one of the things that can teach us is it doesn't necessarily look that clear for everyone. If you were in God's movement back then, if you were a disciple, would it be easy to point to the stoning of Stephen and tell a Jewish relative, see, we were right all along. See, you've proven our point. Jesus was right. You couldn't. You couldn't, because for your Jewish relative, they would think that the stoning of Stephen was a good thing, at best neutral, but they wouldn't see that event as a prophetic event. Only the disciples could learn to see the stoning of Stephen as a prophetic event, a prophetic turning point. For the Jews, it was just one event in many. It wasn't that big of a deal. So we have to be, that was the end of ancient Israel. We have to be prepared at the end of modern Israel that for Adventism, hopefully we have cleaned our Adventist brains so we don't think like that. But for Adventism, like the Jews of old with the stoning of Stephen, can we look at the Sunday law and think, what was the big deal? What's the issue? This isn't simple, this looks complicated. What type of fulfillment of prophecy is that? We have to see things prophetically. I think 1888 is a really good example. 1888 was not the Sunday law of that history. I hope that makes sense. 1888 was kind of like a 2014 or a 2019. It was a stepping stone towards the Sunday law, because in this history, Ellen White, A.T. Jones, they're all warning about the Sunday law that's coming. So when Brodie is teaching on the Hobby Lobby decision, she's like A.T. Jones, she's explaining what is happening in the United States culturally that is preparing the United States for the Sunday law. Just like Adventists in 1888 history looked at 1888 and they saw the Blair Bill by a man whose name was Blair. I think his last name was Blair. The 1888 was the Blair Bill. It was a type of Sunday law. But 1888 was not the Sunday law. It was part of the build-up. And when we go back to 2014 and see things like the Hobby Lobby decision, all that we're doing is saying, look, just like 1888 and the Blair Bill and what was happening in Congress in 1888 was significant to Adventists. So in our dispensation, what happened in 2014 is significant for our Sunday law. What we need to be prepared for is that it is complicated in our time period, that it was complicated for them. It wasn't just about a Sunday law. For them in that history, it was all about the Constitution, rewriting the Constitution, controlling immigration. If they had have just passed a Sunday law bill in 1888 history and made everyone keep Sunday holy, they would have failed in their objective, because it was more complicated than that. Adventists have a too simple idea of prophetic history, and because of that, they think that our Sunday law history will be simple. If we can see that past prophetic fulfillments were not simple, We are prepared that our prophetic events are not simple either. If you go and read A.T. Jones, it makes sense that it wasn't simple because his writing is not simple. He wrote prolifically on all the things that Congress was doing, all the things that were happening in politics in the United States. So Adventists could be prepared for the complicated events that were heating up, what Ellen White describes as the movements then in progress to establish a Sunday law. We are now tracing the movements now in progress to implement a Sunday law. But it wasn't one law in their history. This, I would like to suggest, this Sunday law, if it had happened in 1888 history and been an actual Sunday law, would not have been one law or one event. It would have been multiple events. It had to be because they had multiple goals. They wanted to control the Catholics, control the Jews, control immigrants, change the Constitution, and implement many laws regarding what you could and couldn't do on Sunday across the whole of the United States. That requires many things. It requires them to put into laws what mail can be carried on Sunday, what businesses can operate under what circumstances, what emergency services can operate on Sunday, what churches can do on Sunday, what people can or cannot do on their own property on Sunday, what immigrants can do on Sunday. Their whole constitution had to be changed to make the United States a Protestant nation to control Catholics. That's just a tip of the iceberg. It would have been many things that happened would have had to be put in place in 1888 history to fulfill the Protestant goals. It's the same today. They have many goals when it comes to gender roles. So they're fighting over trans people. They're fighting over abortion. They're fighting in some areas over contraception. They're fighting over equal pay for women, marital rape. All of these different things are being fought over. It's many fights in our history that relate to gender. It was many fights in 1888 history. It wasn't just, we'll implement one Sunday law and the problem will be fixed. We'll be happy. They had many goals, many laws to implement. It was complex. And A.T. Jones was tracing the development of that complicated history. We are doing the same thing when we present on Hobby Lobby and Steve Bannon and January 6th. All of these things are just like them, tracing the many events and the many battles being fought. Gamergate, just like the Blair Bill, they're all waymarks to show us what is developing and the dangers. Do we have any thoughts or questions on what the Sunday law looks like? We don't have a perfect picture yet, but part of the reason I think we don't have a perfect picture is because I can't tell you, we can't speak as a movement and say there is this one law that will be the one and only Sunday law, and then the Conservatives will have won, democracy will have fallen, and it'll all be over. I'd really like to suggest that that won't be the case, and the evidence for it is 1888. It was a much broader fight with many goals in mind for the Protestants. Does that make sense? If it doesn't make sense, please speak. We have, I think, Elder Terry and Brody back on.
Yes, of course.
I think it really helps us.
Thank you so much.
It helps me because I forget, because there's an Adventist brain, there's thinking, there's wires in there. And there's wires in there that think 1888, Sunday law. But 1888 was not the Sunday law. It was like 2014. And it was just part of the escalation. We're tracing the escalation towards a more heated conflict that is developing. The latest Supreme Court decisions, not just the abortion ones, but other decisions as well, are all part of that conflict. And it's, even if we have not studied, and I can't name every Supreme Court case and every issue that's currently being fought in every state, just by looking at the United States, you can see something is happening and it is getting worse. There is what we call a culture war, and it's heating up. And gender is at the center, at the heart of it. We can see that even with just a little information. And we're just trying to understand the Sunday law by getting into that conflict, like the issue with Hobby Lobby, and understanding it, understanding what gave rise to it, and how that Hobby Lobby decision has impacted the escalation of this conflict, just as the Blair Bill was escalating this conflict that should have, if Adventism was faithful, should have led to the culmination in Ellen White's lifetime.